Today, Christianity pauses to meditate, to think, to understand what Christ has done for us. It's amazing, not only has Christianity ceased to function today, surprisingly, even the malls are closed. And other businesses are closed, maybe even giving more respect to this day than some Christians. Basically because we don't really understand what Christ has done for us. In order to understand the gospel, you'd have to go back and see that this was planned prior to what we call Maundy Thursday, Holy Thursday. It was planned, set, probably even before the foundation of the earth. We see that in Exodus, as we read earlier, the very pattern, the very foundation of our salvation was laid out for us. The details of what was going to happen were laid there. Basically, to look at the New Testament alone, you will miss a lot of what God was really planning. The first thing God told Moses was, "This is the beginning of your life." Now, he used terminology a little differently. He said this is the beginning of months. It's the beginning of life. This is now going to set you free from the bondage, the slavery, the things that have held you down. They're no longer going to be able to control you because you're going to be set free. You're going to have new life. And he gives then a direction to the people as to how this is going to take place. And he says to them, now remember, they've been in Egypt for over 400 years. And the longer they've been there, the more cruel Egypt was to Israel. They became more intimidated by them because they grew to be even bigger than the population of Egypt was. Basically, Israel built Egypt to what it was. Probably the pyramids were built by Israel. I don't know. But they did the work. They did the heavy labor. They made the bricks. They laid the bricks. They did all the things that had to be done. But there was a time when God said it's enough. They had turned to Egypt. Israel had turned to Egypt for their salvation. God had planned it that way, but it was only to be momentarily. They refused to leave. They held on to Egypt as their source, and they got into trouble. You can see this in our lives today also. We have turned to the world for our source of provision, and the world is treating us cruelly. They are beating us down, putting us into difficult situations. They can close down the electrical plants anytime they want and say, oh, we don't have power, we have brownouts. They can turn off the water and we don't have anything to drink for how long. They can shut down social media. They can tell us what they want to tell us in the news. We don't know the difference. They treat us the way they want to treat us. They don't give us the respect that is due to us. So we see ourselves very much in a situation wherein this was laid before us. The planning of this was laid here in Exodus. It says, you will take a spotless lamb. A spotless lamb, a lamb without blemish. He who knew no sin will become sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. Here we see the pattern laid before us. And this was to bring about the beginning of our life. Because this that was taking place was going to destroy the power of evil over Israel. And in our lives also, it would also destroy the power of evil over us. The lamb shall be unblemished, a male, year-old. You shall take it and hold it until the 14th day of the month, and then it will be killed at twilight. Notice the details. All these details you will find in the gospel when it records the event that we celebrate today. It's there, today and tomorrow, sharing the plan that was laid in the Old Testament for us. It shares with us God's steadfast love, His devotion to His people and to their freedom in Him. He did not want His people in bondage. He did not create them to be slaves. He created them to be in dominion. Understand what it's saying here, because it's telling us what God was doing for us, not just for Israel. He was setting a pattern for you and for me, that we would then be ready to receive what God has given to us. The lamb was to be shared with neighbors if it could not be consumed in one house. Notice the compassion to others who would not have the ability to consume a lamb. You share this concern for each other. And also notice, nothing was to be left over. Nothing was to be left over. How much of our life have we just given to tomorrow, another day, when in reality God wants us to consume the life He's given to us today? Live it out in fullness, not leaving something for tomorrow. It's amazing how that we have set our own course in our own directions when God gave to us something very powerful. It shows here, I believe, not a sadness, not a sorrow, but it shows here redemption. It shows here commitment. It shows love, devotion, and compassion for His people. Israel went out of Egypt with the wealth of Egypt in their possession. Egypt was bankrupt. When they crossed the Red Sea, the army of Egypt was destroyed. They had no power. All their firstborn men were dead. Their animals were dead. They were left powerless. They were left powerless. They were left powerless. God is speaking to us. He's wanting us to understand His plan. It's amazing how that we've easily forgotten this. In 1 Corinthians, in the 11th chapter, before we finish with Exodus, it says, "Now this day shall be a memorial to you. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance." Now notice how God set this and then set the timing of this never to be ignored. Who celebrates this traditionally all the time? The Jews. They have not forgotten the commandment of God. The question then, was this only for the Jews? Does not this also show to us that this should have been also for us? He says, "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now notice what it says. Because this was not just speaking to Israel. This was speaking to God's people. Spoke to us. Spoke to us. The plague shall not consume you. Will not befall you to destroy you. Doesn't say it won't come upon you, but it won't destroy you. It will not be there. How many times I have reminded us that by the stripes of Christ we have been healed, and that the enemy has no power to bring a plague upon us to a point of destruction. Doesn't have that. Set from the very beginning of time until now. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it tells us in this particular recording of Paul talking to the Corinthians. He said, "For I received from the Lord which I also delivered to you, that Jesus Christ the Lord, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death.'" Now when we talk about proclaiming the Lord's death, does this not take away the curse upon us, the slavery, the bondage, put freedom in our possession? The death of Christ took into himself all of our sin and our iniquity and gave new life to us. Whenever we come to this table, it should be a reminder to us, I have been set free. I have been given new life. My life begins now. My life begins now. Proverbs, it says, "He who remembers the failures of the past, the wrongs of the past, will die." We've been given new life. That should be what's written within our hearts. It's what's written within us. And this is something that we must proclaim. The death of Christ. The death of Christ was our death in him. We are baptized into him. We died with him. We were buried with him. We were raised with him. We were raised not only from the grave, but then we were lifted up into heaven together with him. We are seated together with him now in heavenly places. This is the life now he's given to us. Yet most of the time we find ourselves so compassed, so overcome with the life around us, we see ourselves of flesh only. We don't see ourselves with the blessings and the provision that God has given to us. God's given to us new life. And Paul told his church, this is what God gave me. Christ gave this to me. I'm sharing this with you. This is now your life. This is now your freedom. This is now your hope. Now let's go to the gospel. Let's look at what Luke tells us here in the reading of Luke 22. Because he now gives to us that which was taking place at that time. Jesus was saying to his disciples, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Now notice this was in the heart of Christ from the very beginning. This was set in the Old Testament time. It was not just forgotten and looked at as just history. But it was setting a pattern. It was setting that heart which God was bringing out toward his people to set them free. Christ came for that purpose. And he was longing for this time to come. He wasn't dreading it. He wasn't dreading it. Yes, we saw his struggle in the flesh last Sunday. We saw him struggle, sweat drops of blood, because he was living in the flesh. But spiritually, at this point, his spirit life was still there with him. And he was sharing, I've come for this purpose. This is the reason I've come. And I long to share this with you, because this is the beginning of your life. This is now the beginning of your months. I will say to you, I will never again eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. He worked toward this goal, but he was sharing with them, I'm setting the course now. This is the plan. This is the pattern. It's going to take place in just a few hours. But I want you to understand, this was planned long ago. It was set long before you existed. Now it's being brought into a reality time-wise for you. It was being set so that you could have that freedom and that hope that comes in knowing Christ. This Passover imparts the mystery of the new covenant, and it will inaugurate the great deliverance of humanity from sin and in the power of the cross. Here, man has been lifted now above that which he had been in bondage to sin before because of Adam's sin. Now notice what happened with Israel. God brought them out of Egypt, took them across the Red Sea, a miracle, how they crossed the Red Sea on dry land, took them into the wilderness, and in the wilderness fed them with manna, bread of heaven, gave them water to drink in the middle of the desert, coming from the rock, took care of them. And yet many of them, especially the older ones, were longing for the life of Egypt. They wanted the leeks, they wanted the garlic. They weren't happy with the life that God was giving them. And so these who rejected the freedom God gave to them died in the wilderness. They did not receive the promised land that God had given to them. They didn't make it because they rejected the freedom that God gave to them, rejected the new life that was theirs. Now this should challenge us. This should confront us, because this now says to us, there's a choice in front of you. Will you receive what God has done for you? How many times do we come to the Eucharist? How many times do we totally grasp the meaning of that as a gift to us from God, His love, setting us free, giving new life to us, telling us the enemy has no power over you anymore. He cannot bring the plague upon you. The blood covers you. Not only does the blood cover you, but it also takes away all the iniquity, purifies you, and gives to you the righteousness of God. Do we reject that? Or do we accept it? Part of our life, part of that which God has given to us. It reveals the mystery of the new covenant, because no longer could the enemy proclaim his victory over mankind. It tells us that when Christ overcame the enemy, He made a public display. In Colossians chapter 2, it says, He took our debt to the cross. When He had disarmed the rulers and authorities, He made a public display of them, having triumphed over him over them in him. What does this say? When he rose on Easter Sunday, he was making a declaration. Evil has no power over man any longer. He conquered sin, hell, death, and the grave. And his resurrection made the declaration, sin has lost its power. Remember what he said to us in 1 John chapter 3. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, that he might destroy the works of the devil. This is why he came, to destroy the works of the devil. Yet do we not still accept the works of the devil as part of our life? Is this not what happened to Israel in the wilderness when they accepted Egypt as still having control over them? They were in the wilderness. They were not in Egypt any longer. Egypt had lost its power. Egypt had lost its wealth. It no longer existed as a controlling body of slavery. Didn't have the ability to do this. But in the minds of Israel, the mind of Israel, they wanted to be back in slavery. They weren't willing to accept the freedom that God had given to them. Remember how many times they complained to Moses? Moses complaining to God, why did you give me these people? They weren't happy with the freedom that they had been given. They were happy with the bondage and the slavery. Remember, the scriptures tell us they were crying out for deliverance when they were in Egypt. 400 years of slavery was too much for them. They wanted to be free. When they were given the freedom, they wanted to be back in their slavery. This is given to us for us to evaluate our own lives. This day in history, maybe not exactly this day, but this time in history, Christ sat with his disciples. He shared with them the plan. He gave to them the bread and he said, "This is my body." He was saying, I'm going to the cross. I'm giving my flesh in your behalf. It has to come from the flesh. I'm going to give up my divinity for a moment of time. I'm going to take upon the flesh, the sin of the flesh, the iniquity of the flesh, so that I can destroy it. This is my body, broken for you. Broken for you. He was sharing with them what he was going to do. He was giving them the details. Now we know the story. Peter denied him. The rest of the disciples hid in fear. Even though he had shared this with them, much like Egypt, they rejected what God was giving them through Christ. In our lives, we must be careful how we handle what God has given to us. It must always be with thanksgiving. We may, in our own abilities, be weak at times. But in those weaknesses, God says, I will be your strength. Why? Because God does not want to lose even one. Does not want that. He wants us to be free. And so he shares with us the mystery of the new covenant is given to us in this picture. The sin is gone. The iniquity is gone. Now, new life. Yes. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are new. And all those new things have come from God. Not anywhere else. But are we willing to accept the new things that God has given to us? Do we expect them? You know, he literally says here, there should be this expectation In your life, when you receive this, you should be expecting something to take place in your life. Prepare yourself with this expectation. Something good is going to happen. Something good is going to happen. It may be at the moment it's dark, but don't let the darkness overcome you. Children of Israel were in the wilderness. In the wilderness there were the flies, there were the spiders, there were the snakes, there were all these things. But God was with them, protecting them from those things, if only they would believe in Him. When they failed to believe, then those things could overcome, because they denied the very salvation that God had given to them. How blessed we are to have had Christ go to the cross for us. How blessed we are that He took all of our sin and our iniquity. But do we still claim, I am a sinner? Do we still claim, I am worthless? Do we still claim, I'm not worthy? How can it be? If God would allow His only Son to die in our behalf, would this not tell us how much He loves us? How much He respects us? How much He's willing to pay to make certain that the enemy does not become our landlord. Doesn't want that. He wants us to have the new life that He's given to us. And this is why I don't like Maundy Thursday. I prefer Holy Thursday, because here now is the beginning of new life for us. Yes, it's still the plans, but in just a few hours, the plans are going to be fulfilled. And Christ would give His life, His flesh. His flesh was beaten. His flesh was bruised. Thorns were driven into His flesh. They mocked His flesh. They nailed His flesh upon the cross. But it was through that sacrifice that we have the beginning of life. We have the new life that God has prepared for us. And so we are thankful for this day. Now notice what it said. Celebrate this. Celebrate. You don't celebrate in mourning. You don't celebrate in sadness. You celebrate with an orchestra of 100 horns, trumpets, with lyres, not liars and words, music lyres, with a choir of 300. This is a celebration. How can we get away from giving thanks to God without expressing the greatness of His gift to us? How awesome. How awesome that He would take all this upon Himself that we could be free. When David brought back the Ark of the Covenant, he was so excited about this. He danced in front of the Ark all the way back to Jerusalem. He prepared cake for the whole nation, raisin cake, to give. He brought in all the trumpets, all the musical instruments, and all the singers. All this was a celebration because the ark had been restored. How much we should be giving thanks to God for the new life that is ours, because He took away our sin. When David did all of this, his sin was not yet taken away because the cross had not yet come. Now we have the fullness of the salvation. We have the fullness of the gifts of God given to us. How much more we should be thankful. How much more we should be giving thanks to God and celebrating the new life that He's given to us. It's amazing how we say we celebrate the Eucharist. We celebrate the Eucharist in silence, quietness. Oh, no, there's no joy in it at all. To me, we've missed the point. Joy includes shouting, dancing, singing, playing, bringing excitement into what we are doing. If we're celebrating, if we celebrate a basketball game, we're not sitting down, we're not being quiet, we're screaming and hollering and enjoying ourselves. Should this not be that we give great thanks to God for what He's done for us? Maybe we would feel it's not appropriate to shout and scream and holler, but in our hearts there should be that joy that just wells up within us. I thank God I've been set free. I thank God for the sacrifice He's done for us. I thank God that on Holy Thursday He shared the plan, and the plan began its operation. Judas came, kissed Him, and He was taken away. But He shared what was going to happen. He didn't want them to fear, to be anxious. But they were in fear because they didn't believe, much like Israel. Let us not be that way. Let it, for us, let Maundy Thursday be Holy Thursday. Let it be something that we are excited about, because the plan was brought to fulfillment. No longer just Israel coming out of Egypt. Now it's us coming out of the kingdom of sin and darkness, being brought into the kingdom of light, being given new light, and being fed by the Holy Spirit with what we need. God doesn't fail us. He will not forsake us. May we enjoy what God is giving to us. Amen.